When I first finished the big Switch 2 Nintendo Direct, I, like a lot of people, was pretty impressed. I had some issues, sure, but even as someone who refuses to support Nintendo due to their chronically predatory business practices, I absolutely thought it was a great showing. The Switch 2 looks like the most thoughtful and polished console they've made since the GameCube, emphasizing upgrades that will matter long-term rather than shallow gimmicks that will be used by a few 1-2 Switch-style launch games and then relegated to the shovelware mines. The games looked really solid. 120Hz screen instead of 4K? Genuinely a smart choice. The whole presentation was good, but also like a lot of others, that appreciation was quickly deflated after the Direct ended. It quickly became apparent why Nintendo conveniently left out a lot of the details you'd have expected in such a presentation. $450 for the Switch 2? Not great, but understandable. The inability to play Switch 1 games from a normal SD card on the Switch 2? Kinda dumb, but maybe there's a technical reason for it. Backwards compatibility not being perfect? I saw that coming, but it seems okay-ish depending on how the specifics shake out. A lot of accessories being needlessly expensive definitely hurts more for some accessories like new Joy-Cons than it does for others, but still pretty bad. New games ranging from $70 to $90 in the US, and even more expensive in other regions before factoring in Trump's dogshit tariffs? Pretty awful and unacceptable, especially with remasters so basic that they could be free patches being $60. No excuses, that's just gross. There was one thing though that to some might seem innocuous, but to me is extremely bothersome, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. Switch 2 Game Key cartridges. So basically, the Switch 2 still uses cartridges for games. These are faster than Switch 1 cartridges, which were bottlenecked to speeds that were often slower than a mechanical hard drive could be at its fastest. If Switch 2 cartridges are about as fast as the SD Express cards the system needs for expanded storage, then they're going to be within the range of 150 megabytes per second to 600 megabytes per second. Basically about 50% faster than a mechanical hard drive at its fastest, all the way up to mid-range SATA SSD speeds, the type of speeds that would have been fast around 10 years ago. For perspective, the SSD used in the Xbox Series consoles is around 4 times faster than the fastest SD Express cards, and the PS5's SSD is nearly 8 times as fast, with modern PC NVMe drives clocking in at well over 10 times faster. I mention this not because it's slow, it's not great, but it's about the best compromise I could have imagined from them. However, for anyone who knows how things work with Switch 1 cartridges, there's going to be a glaring issue here. When developers finished a game and needed to print it on a Switch 1 cartridge, they had a choice of several different sizes: 1GB, 2GB, 4GB, 8GB, 16GB, and 32GB. These cartridges were several times more expensive for publishers to buy than the much larger Blu-rays that their competitors use. If you ever wondered why some games were more expensive on Switch despite often being the worst version, and other games required a mandatory download to play at all, this would be why. Part of this cost is going to be down to how much more expensive making a complex cartridge is than a simple disc, but part of it is also undoubtedly Nintendo greed. Doubly so when you factor in that Nintendo pushed heavily for parity between physical and digital copies of the same game, so as to not upset physical retailers stocking their products. But we also cannot deny the reality that, since Nintendo's profits from digital sales are percentage-based, higher physical prices translating to higher matching digital prices means Nintendo gets more money per digital sale. This matters because, given normal Switch 2 game cartridges are bigger and faster, there's no reason to believe the same doesn't apply here, and we can see evidence of this in the cost of the games that already have announced prices. But honestly, I personally think it goes deeper than that. If we jump back to what I said earlier, I mentioned that the Switch 2 doesn't only offer normal game cartridges, it also offers what Nintendo is calling Game Key cartridges. These are slower cartridges, which would therefore obviously be cheaper for publishers to manufacture on, which only contain a key to download the game on a Switch 2 console. These are just a plastic and metal version of those physical game cases you can sometimes buy that only have a paper coat in them, except these are worse for the environment because now you're buying a plastic cartridge in a plastic case instead of a piece of paper in a plastic case. However, Nintendo has tried to implement a bit of fancy sleight of hand in order to make these game key cards seem more valuable than a piece of paper with a coat on it. You see, a game key card isn't restricted to one account. You can take a game key card and let a friend borrow it. They can download the game, and there's no fuss from Nintendo's DRM-loving executives because once they give the game key card back to you, they cannot play the download without it. It's the same as what you'd get from a normal physical... Wait a minute. And here lies the central issue with game key cards, the reason they are nothing but smoke and mirrors. If one wants to buy the game digitally, then they can just buy it digitally from the eShop directly. No fuss, no driving, no dealing with people in a cramped GameStop or whatever, no needing to find physical space for the game case, no worry about if the game is going to be stocked or not. Just put it in your eShop cart, purchase it, and start downloading. If one wants to buy a physical version, you do have to deal with all of that stuff. Gotta drive to the store, deal with the cramped layout and the people, etc. Or else you purchase it from an online retailer and you have to wait for it to be shipped. Either way, you have to have a place to keep it, you have to worry about swapping cartridges, you know the drill. So what about game key cards? Well, it's identical to the normal physical version, isn't it? Because it's still a physical cartridge in a physical case. You still have to go out of your way to pick it up and everything. At which point, why wouldn't you just get a normal game cartridge since it's already there and it's probably right next to the game key cart version on the shelf? An argument I've heard is, well, unlike normal digital copies, you can resell this one too. And that's true, except again, you can do that with a normal physical game as well. Nintendo is trying very carefully to position this as an upgrade over digital codes, rather than a downgrade from standard cartridges, and I believe there are a few intentionally sinister reasons for this. As we all know, Nintendo is notorious for trying to control the market and create FOMO, or fear of missing out, in consumers. The most infamous examples are obviously things like the limited time window that Super Mario 3D All-Stars was available. There was no need for that other than to try and convince a surplus of people who would have otherwise waited for a sale or picked up a used copy to drop full price on the game right then. It's a manipulation tactic. Similarly, Nintendo has a long and storied history of attempting to control the market on their console, dating all the way back to the NES, where they had strict limits on how many cartridges publishers could buy to print their games onto, and they usually gave themselves more than third parties. They hate emulation of games from their old systems, even when those games aren't available on their modern platforms. They also don't seem particularly fond of the used game market, because while retro physical games are ridiculously overpriced these days, a sizable portion of people will go out of their way to buy an old GameCube or what have you and buy their old games on it, which means Nintendo doesn't see a dime from that. Nintendo's solution to that is simply to put a shelf life on the used market for the Switch 2. Yes, you can absolutely resell your Switch 2 game key cards until the Switch 2's download services go down, and considering Nintendo's history with, compared to their peers, rather swiftly shutting down their services after a new console arrives, it's conceivable that these game key cards might only be viable ways to play your Switch 2 games for 5 or so years after the Switch 2's successor arrives. After that point, these carts literally become e-waste with zero value, less value than a normal digital copy because they can't even be backed up and preserved unless already downloaded. But considering the game key cart has a key on it, a normal digital copy is probably going to be easier to preserve in a playable state anyway. Nintendo does not want you to own your games. This isn't necessarily different from the other platforms, but I see a lot more people criticizing Sony and Microsoft for their attempts to strip consumer rights away than Nintendo. A concerning amount of people are giving these game key cards a pass, because if looked at from a specific perspective, they don't seem too bad. If it's a choice between just this or a code, this is better, they say. But that's just a false dichotomy Nintendo wants you to see it from, because it gives them the power to dictate your future game ownership. It means their magic trick here is working. It goes deeper than this though, and I think their longer term goals are broader. Similar to with the used market, I think Nintendo is thinking long-term with these game key cards. Remember the stuff about Switch 1 carts, and therefore likely Switch 2 carts, being expensive for publishers to print their games on? Remember how I said these game key carts are cheaper? And remember how that led to a lot of publishers only putting partial games on smaller, cheaper Switch 1 carts, and then expecting you to download the rest? Yeah, I think just like with the limited availability of the Wii, teaching Nintendo that scarcity was a powerful tool they could artificially create to boost profits, the natural attempts publishers made to save money on Switch releases taught Nintendo that they can use their higher manufacturing costs to drive publishers toward an all-digital future that's favorable to them, without creating the same levels of backlash they'd get if, like Sony and Microsoft have tried, they simply tried making games digital cold turkey. If standard Switch 2 game cartridges are expensive enough, a lot of publishers are going to simply opt to use the game key carts only, or else massively reduce how many normal cartridges they manufacture. And if enough publishers follow this trend, it's entirely feasible to assume Nintendo at some point will either quietly or loudly discontinue standard cartridges. Then your only choices are a physical key for a digital game, or a digital game, both of which expire as soon as Nintendo sees fit and become worthless. Both give more money to Nintendo and less money to retailers and game developers, and they also further limit your ability to find these games at more affordable prices, since Nintendo in particular loves to avoid putting their games on meaningful sale. And for any children today that are adults in 20 years who want to play these games on real hardware, too bad. No matter how family-friendly Nintendo might seem to be, no matter how much nostalgia they offer you, and how big of a part of your childhood they are not your friend. These corporations are not your friends. If they make choices like this one with the game key cards, they are not for your benefit, I promise you. If you want this to fail, if you want at least a fighting chance of being able to keep buying physical games that you own in Nintendo's future, if you want your games to not rise to $80, $90 across the board, I implore you to not give in and buy a game key cart for any games. Let them know it will not work. Let them know that they'll lose more money trying to force us to go all digital than they'll gain. I know I'm kind of just screaming into the void here, and I know this video probably won't see more than a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand views if I'm really lucky. I'm not planning to pick up a Switch 2, so this doesn't directly affect me, but I still care about how Nintendo customers are treated. I was one of them once too, and I wish I could be again. You deserve more respect than they're giving you. Being asked to buy a game whose budget and workforce are both a fifth of your standard AAA title for $10 or even $20 more than those much more costly titles is bad enough. When you then factor in that they're preparing for these tariffs to make these prices even worse, you start to realize how hard they're trying to control the market, to make it so that if you want to experience their products, you have to be prepared to compromise other parts of your life unless you are at least moderately financially comfortable. They want you to sacrifice to pad their wallets, just like a casino. It's emotional manipulation. Nintendo could charge less for their cartridges. They could charge less for the Switch 2, or their games, or their accessories. They could do so many things that they don't, because they don't see you as that wide-eyed child who grew a passion for art through experiencing their earlier works. They don't see you as the adult who still values those experiences immensely and want to recapture some of that magic in a world that looks increasingly bleak, because the people making these decisions don't face that bleakness in the same way you do. To them, you are nothing but a manipulable bag of money. It's up to you whether you're going to let them continue to swindle you, your friends, and the developers who are beaten, battered, and attacked from all angles these days. Or if you're going to stand your ground, actually vote with your wallet, and tell them their scummy tactics can fuck right off. I promise you that not giving into that temptation only feels like the end of the world for a short while, and only the first couple of times. It gets easier once you realize you didn't need what they're selling to survive, because there are boundless examples of other games you can experience and fall in love with just the same. Food for thought. Stay safe.